Jeff Cole here with author Greg Renoff. You know him, you love him. He wrote Van Halen Rising, about the early Van Halen years, how a Southern California backyard party band saved heavy metal. What a great tagline, by the way. Greg, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Jeff, thanks for having me on.
So congratulations on the new book, Ted Templeman, A Platinum Producer's Life in Music. I remember hearing you talk about writing this like 4 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's been a long process. So congratulations.
Thanks.
Now, is this something that Ted wanted to do, or is this something that you pitched to him, this autobiography?
So the latter. So, I did was lucky enough to be able to do a book signing with Ted for my Van Halen book. He came out for it in Pasadena in 2015 and sat and signed books. And in the aftermath of that, which was an amazing experience for me, I talked to him by email and we had a couple phone calls. He was really, I think, excited about all the enthusiasm that people had talking about the old songs and wanting him to, kind of tell stories. And, he'd been kind of living a quiet life out of the music industry for a while. And I eventually pitched him the idea of doing a book. When I talked to him about it and said, look, it's not going to be some sort of, I wouldn't want to write it as some sort of melodramatic, private musings of a record producer, what a hard life I had, whatever, or, how great my life was. It was more about the songs that he produced for the Doobie Brothers, Little Feat, Carly Simon, Van Halen. We could go on and on with the list. Bette Midler. It's endless. The list of huge stars he did. Van Morrison did records with. That when we started talking about it being focused on the records and how you make records and how he worked with these amazing talents, and really that was his big point to me, was that he wanted to spotlight. Of course, the book's about him; it's going to be on him. But he wanted as much to be about, for example, how incredible it was to work with Michael McDonald, to work with Van Morrison or Eddie Van Halen, or any number of these stars who we all look to and understand they were the change makers. They were the ones who really made an impact on music in the late 20th century, roll off the radio and made the records that we all love and the hits. And so when I kind of said it's going to be focused on the songs and the hits and how records are made, he was more. I think understanding of what I would want to do, and he said he would do it.
He wanted to keep it focused on the work, on the music.
Right, exactly.
And that should make for a great read, because not a lot of books do that. Really getting in, do we get into the music and actual, him producing and how these songs came about? Do we get a lot of those kind of stories?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one story I'll tell you, I know you're a big Van Halen fan. It's in the book. He talks a lot about the genesis of the song Jump, which of course becomes the transformative song for the band Van Halen in 1984. And he talks a lot about how, when he first heard the musical idea, when he first heard the musical idea for Jump, he wasn't sold on it, basically the very early demo for it. But as the song developed, he became much more and more enthusiastic, and particularly was now having to wrestle with the ideas that this song is really, really good. It's really, really catchy, but it's so different than other Van Halen songs. He was worried about the reception, whether people were just going to kind of out of hand kind of go, what happened to the Van Halen I loved? It was just sort of like the image. Well, Van Halen was a kind of a guitar-driven band, and it would be so different than the stuff that they had done in the past. He was afraid that it was going to damage the band's brand, for lack of a better term, but he actually loved the song. So there's this paradox for Ted about that song. There was just this, he loved the song, but he didn't think it was necessarily right for Van Halen. And in the end, in the book, he really goes to great lengths to credit Eddie Van Halen, particularly for seeing his vision through on it, basically going, I like this, it's good, this is going to be great, let's do this, and kind of getting everybody kind of going from maybe lukewarm, like David Lee Roth, lukewarm, Ted, lukewarm, a little nervous about it, to basically making it into this anthem that, as Ted said now. My favorite line from the book actually is, when it comes to Van Halen, is where Ted talked about how he initially thought when he heard the demo, it was a little bit like an organ you'd hear in a stadium, like duh, like in between innings. He said, I don't get it. Like, I don't think this is going to work for Van Halen. And now, of course, he realizes, of course, that pretty much every sporting event you ever go to in a stadium, you hear Jump. So he said, I was actually right about that. It fits perfectly, and it's become this, this transcendent song. So there's, those are the great moments for me as a collaborator with him, to kind of talk about these the genesis of a song like that, and then the evolution, rather than just sort of having the song, quote unquote, come out in the book and be like, it's out. He really takes you in the studio and explains the process of creativity with a song like that.
Well, going back to the beginning, as you mentioned, he was in a group called Harper's Bazaar that had a little bit of success in the late 60s. What was it that prompted him to sort of end that part of his career and get into engineering and producing?
Yeah, so so Ted was like a lot of kids in the late 50s, early 60s. He got really turned on by early rock and roll, Jerry Lee Lewis and this stuff. But then when the Beatles came along, it was all about the Beatles. And so he forms this group that's actually called the Tikis in Santa Cruz, California, with 4 of his friends. They eventually end up on Warner Brothers, and they get this new band name, Harper's Bazaar. And so they do four albums, and Ted enjoyed the band process. He enjoyed writing songs. He enjoyed working with his bandmates in the creative aspect. What he didn't love was performing. So they did a lot of stuff on the road. In fact, Ted did these. One of the great things about the book, too, is these chapters about Harper's Bazaar. Again, would not be on the radar of most people. I didn't know very much about the group, but it was this type of thing where Harper's Bazaar performed in stadiums for 50,000 people with Bob Hope and Raquel Welch, raising money for the USO in '67, these types of things. So they did these very, very big events. But what Ted really learned during these years, what he really loved working in the studio, that what really got him off was actually what was going on the other side of the glass. He never thought he was a great singer. I mean, he knew he was a good drummer, but he didn't think he was, a guy who could be a studio drummer, one of these guys who could come in and play anything off the, on a drop of a hat or anything. And he just didn't think sort of the road life and that life of a musician was something that he was going to feel energized about, being gone all that time. And so he started to kind of shift his interest towards studio stuff. So he spent a lot of time basically apprenticing, basically staying after sessions, sitting with engineers, guys like Don Landy, who later was Ted's partner and collaborator for well over a decade with the Van Halen years, Doobie Brothers and all this stuff, and a lot of other big producers. Ted got to see some amazing sessions. As a guy who was just hanging around studios, you got to see Elvis record. I mean, he stood in the studio and watched Elvis record, got to see Frank Sinatra record. And so Ted had a lot of those experiences that sort of made him really want to shift his focus away from being a performer to being a producer. And that was his sort of evolution there, from being a musician to being the guy on the other side of the glass.
So that's where he really got bit. It wasn't the performing. It wasn't. It was when he saw what happened in the studio, making the music. Now, you mentioned the collaboration of him and Don Landy, which I think I heard this story from you while you were writing the book a couple of years ago. He was the first one to put Don Landy's name credited on the record, on the label.
Yeah, correct? So Don and Ted met during the Harper's Bazaar days, and it's pretty much soon after Ted was a junior producer, and Don had done did 3 or 4 years as an engineer, and Ted really clicked with Don and kind of picked him to be his guy. And so they did a number of records in 71 and 72, 73. They did the Captain Beefheart record. They did the Little Feat record. They did the second Doobie Brothers record, which is Toulouse Street, which is right here. That was really one of Ted's first really big hits as a producer, along with some of the Van Morrison stuff. But what ended up happening between Don and Ted is that, Ted was really, I think, somebody who was very aware of the fact that there are a lot of people who go into making a record a success. I mean, the musicians get a lot of credit, obviously. The songwriters, the singers, those guys are going to get a lot of credit. They're going to get these men and women are going to get their name on the label and that type of stuff. But he really understood from working in the studio for so many hours that, the guy who is actually getting that drum beat just right on the record, that people's ears perk up when they first hear it on the radio. I mean, think about something like, which Don and Ted didn't do, obviously, but Hurt So Good by John Cougar. I mean, that you hear that beginning with those drums, and just immediately like, the song. And so Ted was very tuned in on that, how great Don was, and wanted to make sure that people knew about it. And he put Don's name on the label. So there were some engineers who had happened. It wasn't the first time, but Don really sort of became someone that Ted was looking out for and was going, I want his name on the record right next to mine. So it's not just Ted Templeman, it's Ted Templeman and Don Landy. And
talking about Ted and Don, what happened during the Van Halen breakup? Ted goes off and does Dave's solo record. Mm-hmm. Don goes and works on 5150. Mm-hmm. Was there any contention with them sort of working separately? What happened during those few years? Well,
I mean, I think the short answer was there was contention. I think one thing that's interesting, I'll start with the back end of the story first, is that when 5150 was completed, and Don and Ed and Mick Jones had worked on it, and Ted had not. Ted was still an executive at Warner Brothers. That Ed and Don Landy brought the record, the unfinished record, to Ted in his office at Warner Brothers and had him help sequence it. So while there was definitely a contentious sort of end to that period of time, which I'll get into in a second, there was always sort of a mutual respect and a kind of, I think, a willingness to sort of say, heat of the moment stuff had happened, and those guys were all willing to move on. Don and Ed had become sort of very, very close collaborators. So Don and Ed worked together on 5150 with Mick Jones from Foreigner comes in, and then yes, Ted goes with Dave. But in the book, I mean, it's kind of a little bit of a spoiler, but I don't think it's anything I shouldn't say right now. Is that, Ted did not want them to break up. He didn't. He was, it wasn't as if he was like, great, I've got Dave, and now I can go off on my own and do what I want. He was actually sick with the idea of those guys splitting up because he thought it was the greatest rock band in the world. I mean, he was just a bigger fan than anybody. So for him, it was just a sickening thing that they couldn't work it out. But in the end, obviously, what happened, and Dave asked him to produce a record, so he produced it. But it was never a matter of him going, oh, good, we broke up the band so I can get Dave.
Now I've got two.
Right.
Which, by the way, that Eat 'Em and Smile record is amazing. It's one of the most lost records of that era. I mean, to me, it's up there with 5150. I love Eat 'Em and Smile, and it's just sad that you don't hear it on the radio. It's not often talked about,
right?
But it really is amazing.
Yeah, and I think the thing about that is just a quick point, which I don't think we even discussed in the book, was just that I think people know the Van Halen's got the brand. I mean, at the end of the day, the Van Halen's, they had the songwriter and they had the brand, and I don't think Dave could compete with that for over the long haul.
What was Ted Templeman's arrangement with Warner Brothers? So he was one of these producers that produced, but also had an executive role.
Right, exactly.
And when did that start? Like, how was that was he doing that the whole time? He, did Van Halen and the Doobie Brothers and everyone else. He was also part of the executive staff.
So Ted's first gig as a producer for Warner Brothers, let's go back to the very beginning. In 1970, Ted is working as a tape listener for Warner Brothers. So he got, he had his career as a Warner Brothers recording artist and got a job eventually at the very bottom entry-level job, which is, guess what, Ted? Welcome to work. Here's 50 demo tapes. Go in a room with no windows, turn on the tape recorder, and listening to all these demos and these unknown bands, hoping for something to come along. And eventually Ted found the Doobie Brothers tape. And
that's how the Doobie Brothers were found.
Right. Ted found the tape and then brought it to his producer, the guy who produced him as a member of Harper's Bazaar, a gentleman by the name of Lenny Waronker, later became president of Warner Brothers Record, very successful producer himself. And so Ted and Lenny eventually got the chance to produce the first Warner Brothers record. So that was Ted's first gig. By 1973, Ted had a couple of albums that had done with Toulouse Street and a couple of other albums, the Little Feat record, and Ted got a job, got promoted to what was basically called A&R staff producer. So you sort of was you got elevated to the creative team. So where there would be Russ Titleman, Lenny Waronker, John Cale, another number of these other individuals who would, decide what records were going to get made, basically, and then they would offer up their services as the in-house producers. Mm-hmm. There are bands on Warner Brothers, like for example, Deep Purple, right, which didn't use a Warner Brothers in-house producers, but a lot of times bands would get signed, acts would get signed, and would come on to the Warner Brothers label, and they would basically talk to the staff, the staff producers and the staff A&R guys, and go, yeah, I want to work with Russ Titleman, I want to work with Ted or whatever. And there would basically be the ability to have that in-house. And the advantage of that for the acts were, of course, you're not just a producer living in England who's produced Deep Purple and now you're off to doing something else. You've produced this act and now you can be inside the company and help basically promote it in many ways. Basically, you kind of have an understanding of the band. What singles should we put out? How should we promote this band? You've had that working relationship, and that was one thing that Ted had that from about 1973 up until his retirement when he exited the company in 1998 or so.
And that would be how he was able to get Van Halen signed.
Correct. Right,
and what's the exact story of? I'm sure you covered this in the Van Halen Rising. Mm-hmm. Van Halen does their thing. They're playing all the They're playing all the clubs. He spots them. This is after Gene Simmons makes his demo. Mm-hmm. He sees him at the Starwood.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it?
Yeah. So
and he says, "Hey, Mo Austin, the head of Warner Brothers, I want to work with these guys. We got to sign them. Yada yada yada."
Yeah, that's it.
It's like out of a movie,
right? That's it in a nutshell. Basically, Ted got a call, got a tip. Hey, I got this. There's a band out at the Starwood. You should come see. Ted went down there to the Starwood Club in Hollywood and saw this band, Van Halen. And Ted said he was blown away, particularly by Eddie Van Halen. For Ted, the initial thing that he loved. I mean, he liked the band, but he loved what he saw from Eddie Van Halen. And then, yes, he brought down Mo Austin and Russ Titleman to, again, Russ as being another staff producer, and then Mo being the head of the company, he was the CEO of Warner Brothers at that point, brought them down to the Starwood and basically made the deal there on the spot for the, to say, yeah, you should come on Warner Brothers. Eventually they finalized the record deal, and yeah, the rest is history. But yeah, that would be Ted's big, second big feather in his cap, was seeing, basically discovering in air quotes, discovering Van Halen and getting them signed to a record deal. And of course, the rest being just massive success right out of the gate.
Listening to Van Halen Zero, the demos you can find on YouTube, you hear all the Eddie riffs, you hear the songs that made the first record, the second record. I'm guessing that comparing that to what you hear on the final record is a lot of Ted's work, because these songs are done, they're demoed, but then they're different on the actual record. Does he go into arrangements? Like, is that part of what Ted did, making those first couple of records? Because the songs, you can tell there's, this riff's here, this riff's here. Is that the work of Ted?
Well, I mean, I don't think Ted would take full credit for that. I think what Ted would say was that one of his gifts, I mean, I don't know if he would phrase it that way, but one of his talents is the ability to sort of listen to songs and then be able to work on arrangements, work on figuring out which songs have quality, and then, figuring out how to make an artist shine. I mean, that's what thing that Ted said to me early on. He said, I was a lighting guy. And I said, what do you mean by that? He goes, I was the guy who made the stars look good. I wasn't the guy who wanted all the credit. I just wanted to be sort of in this, behind the scenes and be like, do the thing. And so these people can get out there, these performers can get out there and have their talents appreciated by the public. In other words, how do you take someone who you go and you hear in a room going, God, this person is such amazing talent, they're such a great singer, and really be able to make it accessible to the most number of people. And that's really the goal of a producer on a label like Warner Brothers. And he talks a lot about that in the book, basically his work with Ed and Al, and sort of say, hey, what if we took this part and chopped it out and moved it over here? And they would be able to do that. He said the word he uses, they were so modular in their songwriting. And he said some other musicians would struggle with if you say, hey, what if we took this and moved here? They would sort of lose those transitions between the parts, and they would really struggle with that. But he said the brothers, particularly Ed, had this genius ability to go, oh, okay, I'll just do this little thing here, this little transition, and we'll change it, and it will just go straight through. And so a lot of the songs came about that. But the other thing too, that the rehearsal for Ted, and he did this with other bands like Little Feat as well, the Doobies, he really tried to do a tremendous amount of rehearsal beforehand, because he didn't want the studio in most cases to be a place where there was a lot of writing done. Now, for some bands that happened more than others, Doobies that happened more, but he really wanted to get it on tape. And so that was the thing for him, especially with a band like Van Halen. They had raw energy, get them rehearsed. These guys were so talented. Get them in there, bang, do it 2 or 3 times, record it, the song 2 or 3 times. Dave needed to patch something up vocally, you patch it up. Maybe there's a bum note or something here by Ed, you cut it out, you fix it, like a little thing here and there, and boom, the records are done, and you move on to the next thing. So for him, that was actually something he had learned from working with Van Morrison, where he talked a lot about, it really actually, for people who are Van Morrison fans, I would really recommend the book, because Ted goes into great detail about what he learned on the fly working with Van, who's, Ted has great sympathy for him as a person. He thinks he's sort of a misunderstood genius. He's, obviously Van is known as kind of a curmudgeon and has been, known to be difficult. But, Ted said it's just sort of his personality quirks and the way he is. And he didn't want to spend time in the studio, and actually refused to. So it was just walking in, and Ted was very young, and Van Morrison had already had hits. And so Ted was basically producing with Van. Ted was in the control room. Van's in the big room with his band. And Ted would say, I have all these plans about what he's going to do with Van. And like, okay, we're going to do this. We'll do this for the song. And Van would just come in the studio and just pick up his car and go, 1, 2, 3, 4. And they would just start. And, like the engineer was already rolling tape, knowing from Van, and if he could get Van to do it one more time, He said that was a miracle. Like most of the time, it was just one take.
What's the Van Morrison that Ted produced that we know? Like,
so Wild Night. So Ted produced Wild Night, and that's a great song to talk about because that was Ted's first hit as a producer, and a classic example of, as Ted points out, just very, very quickly done. But also, the other thing I would say about that is that it really had some amazing individuals who worked on that record. Probably the person that people would recognize most notably from that session would be Ronnie Montrose. Later went on to fame, obviously, with Montrose, with Sammy Hagar. And the first guitar part you hear on the song Wild Night, which is all heard on the radio, that great hooky little clean guitar part, that's actually Ronnie Montrose. That's
Ronnie Montrose.
That's Van Morrison. And so that would be, the basically the biggest hit, I think, that came out of that time together. But Ted was enormously grateful to Van Morrison and to Ronnie, because Ted really could see how gifted Ronnie was as an arranger, and had to come up with these little parts for these songs to kind of sweeten things up. And again, had to be done very quickly with Van, who didn't have patience for a lot of hanging out in the studio. He wouldn't do it. And so that was one of the reasons why Ted was so confident and excited about the Montrose record and working with Ronnie, because he had already seen how talented Ronnie Montrose was from working with Van.
Why do you think that that Montrose record, the first Montrose record with Sammy Hagar, is another classic record that kind of got lost, didn't really live up to its potential, so to speak? Any thoughts from you on why? For sure. Yeah. So the Montrose record was made in the summer of 1973, and at the time, if you think about what hard rock was sort of its mainstream, was Alice Cooper, Led Zeppelin,
Purple, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin. So a lot of longer songs. Oftentimes, especially with a band like Sabbath and with Alice Cooper, more darker themes. It was so you stretch things out, you have longer songs, and you have these darker themes. And Ronnie Montrose and Ted kind of hatched this idea to do, basically diffuse pop and heavy metal. That basically Ted had seen for something like Wild Night, how great Ronnie was at kind of writing these little hooky little riffs, but also that Ronnie had this ability to play these incredibly heavy Zeppelin-esque, for lack of a better term, these big monster guitar riffs that are all over the Montrose record. And Ronnie said, okay, we'll write short songs, pop songs, basically pop styled songs, but have that real crushing hard rock, or what would have been called at the time heavy metal sound to them. And the record really, as you mentioned, didn't break through at all. Actually, I think it peaked at like 153, or people can fact check me on that. It peaked in the middle of the 150s, 160s or something, and it just plummeted off the charts. And what ended up happening, Ted realized in the aftermath, was that the songs he thought maybe were good enough as singles weren't good enough. And so what ended up happening was that Montrose didn't have an AM radio hit. Unlike the Doobie Brothers, have Listened to the Music, China Grove, Blackwater, they had all these AM radio pop hits. So they actually had some songs on the record which were kind of crunchy and heavy, the Doobie Brothers, but they also had these songs that everyone loved when they heard it on the radio. With Montrose, that didn't happen. And so that was what ended up happening. They sort of fell through the cracks because they didn't have an AM radio hit. One of the things that's really was interesting for me with Ted, too, is that he was really haunted by the records that didn't sell. And again, it wasn't so much for him like, oh, I wanted to make all this money, because obviously, in retrospect, Ted's made plenty of money as a producer. He was very successful, sold millions of records. But for him, it was just more that he felt like he let those guys down. Like he's like, I had a plan, they trusted me, and it doesn't work. And so there's a number of records he talks about that, and just how frustrated he was that, I took my eye off the ball, or something just didn't work, and just, where he felt very confident as a leader, and like anything else in, coaching a football team or something, when you think you've got the winning play dialed up and it doesn't happen, you're just crushed at the end. Like, how could we possibly lose? We had everything going for us. And so for him, that was interesting to hear how, like, he just sits there and kind of still can dwell on that. Like, oh, I just, Little Feat should have been bigger. Montrose should have been bigger. These bands that were incredibly talented, but didn't connect the way that Ted had hoped.
Back to the 1984 record, Ted brings Michael McDonald in to finish or work on I'll Wait. Now, when I first heard this, I thought, oh, he must have, written the keyboard part in the opening of I'll Wait.
Right.
Then I read that, oh, he actually helped Dave with the lyrics.
Right.
And when I listen to I'll Wait, that sounds like Dave lyrics. How did that come about, and what exactly, if Ted talks about it, what was his contribution to that track?
Now, I'll Wait was a song that Ted was actually continued to be lukewarm about, kind of from beginning almost to I don't say necessarily all the way to the end, but sort of was like, he actually liked it a lot less than Jump. Again, once he sort of heard Jump, it was like, this is, okay, we're going to go this way. I'm nervous, but we're going to go this way. But he never really loved the I'll Wait song idea. And the thing was that, for lack of a better term, I mean, Dave really never jived with it either for whatever reason. Like, Dave couldn't quite get a handle on it. So there was the keyboard part was there. Again, I don't know exactly, I've never heard a demo of it, but sort of like the basic keyboard part. But that isn't a song. You might have the beat, you have the keyboard part, maybe a bass line, you need a melody, and you need lyrics. And so the working method was basically Eddie would write the, quote unquote, the music, write the chords, write the solo parts, these types of things, along with Alex or whatever, and then they would kind of go, and Dave would write a vocal melody and write lyrics, and Dave couldn't quite get it. And so they were stuck, again, trying to finish the record. This is actually, September or something like that, and they're still already a little bit behind schedule. And so Ted was talking to Dave, and according to Ted, Dave is the one who said, "Hey man, do you think you get Michael McDonald to come sit with me? I'm really stuck." And Ted said, "Sure, I'd be call him." And so he called him up, and what happened is Michael McDonald, who had written, like James Ingram, Michael McDonald solo records. I mean, Carly Simon. We could go down the list and it's like Christopher Cross. I mean, every person in the world he had written. He's incredible, Carly Simon. So, he was like the songwriter of songwriters. And so he came in and sat with Dave, and according to Ted's memory, composed the chorus melody and some of the lyrics. Again, I don't know which words, that Dave had versus what Mike did, but basically sat with a keyboard in Ted's office with Dave, singing things and kind of coming up with the finish the song. And then there was a kind of a eureka moment. This is it. This is going to work. They come back and they cut the song. And so, yeah, it's interesting. That was the moment where kind of the Doobies and Van Halen overlap, which is sort of like a totally, in some way, sort of like a yacht rock type of thing. You think that would be like episode 6 of Yacht Rock, but actually, yeah, that ended up happening. But yeah, I mean, it was in some ways smart of Dave because he was stuck, and of course at that point Ed was really wanted the song on the record. I think that was a thing too that really was, part of the kind of get back to the sort of the tension. I don't think Ted actually ever voiced it to me exactly this way, but I would kind of, again, knowing what I know, I mean, again, the sort of the keyboard material was very, very, very close to Ed's heart. He wanted, this was who he was. He felt musically now. He was evolving. This is who I am. This is my music. You guys should respect that and be like, embrace, I don't know, embrace it, but basically be, understand this is my identity now as a songwriter. And we can see that happening over the course of the next few records, of course. And so I think he really wanted it on the record. And so, that was kind of the Hail Mary to get Mike McDonald in, finish the record, and then I'll wait. Makes the record the second side of the record.
And I feel like it was kind of hidden too, because he wasn't credited on the record.
No, he wasn't credited on the record. There's quite a story there. I think I don't think that Ted fully knows exactly what went on with that, but from the way Ted discusses it in the book is that the song, right, was written with Mike McDonald, who obviously contributed actively to the songwriting. But when the record came out and the credits were there on the second side of the record, there was no word of Michael McDonald. And so actually, I mean, I'm chuckling about it now, but actually it was a very difficult thing for Ted. Ted still isn't quite sure what the hell happened, like why Mike McDonald didn't get credited initially. There was some, as he just said, something happened in the Van Halen camp where there was something was done and that didn't happen for whatever reason. But it actually had a very detrimental effect, at least in the short term, with his relationship with Mike McDonald, because Mike felt very kind of betrayed. I don't necessarily think 100% by Ted, but just the sense of like, I did this as a favor to you in some sort of ways. Like,
and this record's a huge hit.
And how could you guys do this to me? Where Ted had nothing to do, even as the producer. It's up to the songwriters to basically, basically there's documentation. You write out when you submit records, you figure the splits, go, okay, this guy gets 40%, this guy gets 40%, this guy gets 20%, whatever it is. There's sort of these song publishing documents, and Ted didn't have anything to do with that. He didn't write the songs. And so, he sort of gets this phone call out of the blue. He goes, "What are you talking about? Like, this is impossible." And they're like, so it was kind of a big mess. And, but eventually Mike does get paid. In fact, if you pick up the remastered copies of 1984,
he's credited. So he did end up getting it.
Yeah, I think Mike
out.
McDonald, he didn't tell me this personally. I've never spoken to Mike McDonald, but in some interview, he said, I guess those guys thought I was like Santa Claus or something like that. And they realized I wasn't, or made some joke about it. So, yeah.
So a few years after Sammy joins Van Halen, they bring Ted in to help work on For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge.
Let's talk about that as kind of the ride out here. Yeah, so For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, that was the one where what ended up happening was Ted was in his office, and he had actually done some work with Ed recently. Right before that, most people don't know this, but there was 2 albums done in 5150 by a band called Private Life. Don Landy and Ed did the first Private Life record, and then Don left, for lack of a better term, left the music industry, and Ed called Ted to say, "Hey, I've got this second Private Life record. Would you do it with me?" And Ted said, "Sure." So he came down and they did the record together. And then some months later, I don't remember off the top of my head how many, like 6 something months later, he got another call from Ed going, "Hey, Ted, can you come into the studio to help us?" And at the time, Andy Johns, who had worked with Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones and had quite a record as Cinderella record as a producer on his own, was working with Van Halen. And Ted was like, "What do you need?" He said, "We need someone to come in and crack the whip." And so going back to sort of the deadline thing where those guys had kind of up there working, recording all this stuff, and they were not progressing the ball down the field, as they would say in football. They weren't getting to the goal line, and then Ted came in to help Sammy do his vocals. So Ted worked with Sammy closely on that record on his vocals, and then helped him sequence the record and kind of figure out what songs to keep on it and whatnot.
And so nowadays he's been retired. What does he do? Is he?
Yeah, I mean, I think he sort of enjoys his quiet life on the West Coast. He's he's a person who enjoys architecture. He really is somebody who I think has kind of done his fill of that type of stuff. I mean, you can imagine after spending decades living, in dark rooms with listening to music, I think he's just sort of, kind of enjoying the life outside of that. And I think that was kind of the interesting thing for me too. It wasn't as if, Ted was looking for somebody to come in to sort of like, I need someone to tell my story. I feel an enormous amount of gratitude to Ted for trusting me to do this. But also, I would also say along with that too, I'm very appreciative and grateful just in general that he would let me record these stories, because there were so many amazing, I think, insights that can be gained. Anyone who's interested in music, or anyone who wants to be a recording artist, or, even does a home studio stuff. I mean, just sort of those types of mental tricks he talks about in the book about working with artists and kind of how to psychologically deal with the pressures of the studio and how to get people through that. I mean, there's a lot of institutional knowledge there that it would have been lost if Ted didn't let me kind of get it on, and hopefully in a story that people could really relate to, of a guy who went from, just a kid who loved jazz in Santa Cruz to the very, very peak of the industry and kind of went off into the sunset and was a happy man.
The perfect time. Oh man, Greg Renoff, thank you so much. Wow, we did an hour. I appreciate you spending this time. Ted Templeman, A Platinum Producer's Life in Music. You can get it at templemanbook.com. Also check out Greg's other book, Van Halen Rising. Get that at vanhalenrising.com, about the early years. Man, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, it was fun. I enjoy talking about this stuff, and
I can tell you do, because I've been I've always been following you, and whenever I'm on my Facebook feed, I'm like, hey, Greg Renoff on my podcast. I'm there and I'm listening, so I've been very familiar with hearing your stories, and if the book's half as good as the way you're able to convey it, on radio and on podcasts and stuff, I can't wait to read it. Yeah, like I said, I remember you talking about this book 4 years ago, and I'm like, damn, what a great idea. I cannot wait to read that book. How the hell am I going to wait 4 years?
Well, that makes me feel really good. Yeah, it's been a lot of hard work on Ted's part and my part. Both of us worked really, really hard. A lot of long, late night emails from Ted, kind of, again, just sort of to put it together. And for me, it was a labor of love in a lot of ways, like we've talked about already. I mean, I love love music, and I love the records that Ted made. Aerosmith. We didn't even talk about Aerosmith, and we go through all these other records that he made that I loved as a kid, and the Crazy from the Heat EP with Dave, and just to have the opportunity to sit with him was just a dream come true for me. And so, yeah, I was happy to put in the work.